So we will, we're going to jump right into it for time, the sake of time. The first paper that we will be attending to is Holly Dunn's paper, taken from her book project, The Logic of Popular Justice in Response to Witchcraft in the Eastern DRC, The Unanticipated Outcomes of Disconnected Legality. And the discussant will be Beth Whitaker, from UNC Charlotte. So as I said, I'll keep time. Don't worry, nobody else worry about time. I'll be the timekeeper. 45 minutes. Holly, if you can situate the paper for us in a few minutes, and then we'll move into Beth's intervention, that will start us all off. And actually, I'll ask everyone, I'm going to do it myself right now. If you're not speaking, to please mute yourself.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily. And I may take a little longer than the other papers to situate it a little bit because it's a chapter later in the book and there's sort of no contextualization in the chapter. At least I can provide some of that now. So I'm really appreciative of this opportunity. I think this is the last year I get to take advantage of being, an emerging scholar and get this great feedback. So I'm really, really happy that I get to do this. The chapter is one that I was kind of in the midst of reorganizing when I sent out, so it kind of starts to slowly crumble as it moves along, but I think at least we can talk about the broader themes and concepts and sort of how I'm linking them to the book argument. So a little bit about the book. The book project explores encounters between internationalized legal norms and practices. So in other words, sort of liberal legalism or Western law, or this sort of globalized approach to doing state law, and the encounters between that and the more localized contexts and justice beliefs and practices. So I look specifically at post-conflict Democratic Republic of Congo, which has hosted extensive state building and peace building interventions that have a rule of law focus, and even more specifically focus on prosecuting sexual and gender-based violence, which stems from this movement to address wartime rape, but in more recent years has moved beyond sort of prosecuting wartime rape to broader sexual and gender-based violence issues. And these interventions have really profoundly shaped the legal terrain in the DRC, but specifically in the Eastern DRC. So the findings I present in the book are based on 9 months of immersive fieldwork in Uvira in South Kivu. So I interviewed over 100 people. I observed court proceedings, mediation proceedings. I participated in local events, spent most of the time there living with a local family, and worked with a few different interpreters. So that's sort of the context of my the information I gathered. So the argument that I put forward in the book is that these interventions have shaped the legal terrain in unexpected and unanticipated ways. So I follow scholars who conceptualize legal pluralism as complex, as either a palimpsest, drawing on interlegality, if we're talking about sort of the work of De Souza Santos, semi-autonomous fields, the work of Sally Falk Moore, and the sort of construction of tradition, if we look at Mamdani and others who look at the colonial era and sort of this construction of tradition through the colonial encounter. So rather than, and I say that to sort of contrast it to this idea that legal pluralism is sort of a binary between modern and traditional types of law and justice. So what I find to be missing from the current analyses of rule of law building in post-conflict situations that have this sort of legally pluralistic context, which is most of them, is the role of legal consciousness in shaping the outcomes of encounters, of these legal encounters, specifically rule of law interventions. So the goal of interveners who are focused on state building or peace building with this rule of law component is to sort of more or less replace other systems of law and justice with state liberal legalism, sort of the dominant way of doing law globally that I sort of mentioned. However, the research to date shows that these usually fail by their own standards. So by the standards put forth by the rule of law interveners, these interventions typically fail or at best offer sort of mixed results. Now, these failures are understood from a top-down lens, right? They're understood from the perspective of the interveners. And they typically sort of note that the failures stem from a lack of time, resources, and expertise going into these rule of law building projects, or problematic local culture that serves as a barrier to implementing rule of law. So what I argue, what I want to do with the book is sort of understand this problem more comprehensively. And so to do that, we need to consider the outcomes through the lens of the population, not just through the lens of the interveners. So I do that by considering popular legal consciousness. Legal consciousness, I understand, is sort of everyday, people's everyday or common sense understandings and interactions with the law or other systems of justice. So in the context of this encounter, different elements of legal consciousness coexist in tension with each other. And I'll get into what those different elements of legal consciousness are, but they come into tension with each other in the context of encounter, both individually at the individual level and at the social level. And this leads to new patterns of engagement and sense making around the law and legality. So the outcome, what I label emergent hybrid legality, integrates aspects of different legal justice systems and understandings of law and justice to produce unanticipated hybrid and emergent forms of legality. And this helps us understand from the side of the population, rather than just interveners, why attempts to sort of impose or normalize liberal legalism do not lead to those anticipated outcomes. So that's sort of the broad project in which I'm situating this chapter on witchcraft and popular justice. A bit in terms of sort of conceptual development. Legal consciousness, I sort of build on the work of other sort of leading scholars in this area, namely David Engel, and divide legal consciousness into 5 areas of subjectivity: knowledge, perception, and judgments, which we typically associate with more individual level elements, and then worldviews and legal ideology, which appear to be sort of more social, although obviously sort of the individual and social are interconnected in all ways, essentially. Then the sort of areas, how I develop this is by noting the way that these different elements are in tension with each other, producing contradictory legal consciousness. And in the chapter, I engage with 2 themes of contradictory legal consciousness: disconnect and harm naming, and different logics of justice. So just for the next couple minutes, I will explain how I'm relating those to witchcraft and popular justice, and sort of where I'm at in terms of going forward with the chapter, where I'm sort of stuck at the moment. So disconnect and harm naming is pretty straightforward. And this is essentially that, what the state defines as a harm, what the state law defines as a harm, drawing from this sort of globalized liberal legalism, is disconnected from what the population views as a harm. And this is very evident in the case of witchcraft, where the state does not recognize witchcraft. Some African states do, the state in Congo does not. What they do recognize is that accusations of witchcraft can be prosecuted as either forms of sort of libel or slander or something along those lines. So if you accuse somebody of witchcraft, that's the harm, not actually being a perpetrator of witchcraft. And then, so from the side of the population, this is obviously really problematic, because as part of the dominant worldview and understanding of the world, witchcraft exists. Without doubt, unequivocally, witchcraft is a part of people's everyday lives experiences, and it's a grave harm. It is something that causes harm to individuals and communities at large. Okay, so here we have this disconnect in harm naming. The second component or theme of contradictory consciousness is different logics of justice. So here, the state ignores witchcraft accusations. The state will not hear, listen, follow through with any accusation of witchcraft. And as I mentioned, in fact, they can prosecute those who make the accusations. So this sort of fits with a rational, what's typically used as a rational logic of justice that's based in sort of evidence and sort of material evidence. that cannot be sort of magical or based in what the state would call superstition or anything along those lines. By contrast, the population's logic of justice from which they're working in cases of witchcraft is one where, again, this is a grave harm, and thus the repercussions are expected to be equally grave. So with other harms that I look at throughout the book, the population will often turn to mediation or sort of dispute resolution, conflict resolution. That's a little bit harder to achieve in cases of witchcraft because it is perceived as such a deep or profound harm. So what typically happens is community members attempt to sort of ostracize or banish the person who has usually repeatedly been accused or perceived as participating in witchcraft or doing acts of witchcraft. But at the extreme, right, with somebody who continuously perpetrates acts of witchcraft, right? This is where popular justice has become sort of normalized because the state will not do anything, because mediation does not sufficiently recognize the harm of witchcraft. People turn to popular justice as a way of dealing with this. And so we here have the different sorts of logics of justice that are a part of people's legal consciousness. They have knowledge of the law and an understanding of what the legal system will and won't do, and that does not fit with their interpretation of what justice would look like in this situation. So the sort of jumping off from there and speaking to what I'm trying to do with the broader book and these sort of relationship between these concepts is to think through how different configurations of legal consciousness produce different justice outcomes, different forms of emergent hybrid legality, different ways of engaging with the law and justice. And that's sort of where I'm still trying to work through the arguments in this chapter and say, okay, so this is what the disconnect and harm naming looks like. This is what the tension in different logics of justice look like. How can I articulate why that leads to popular justice? And for those of you who may not be familiar with the term popular justice, this is essentially a type of vigilante justice where community members as a group work together to, in most of the cases that I learned about in Uvira and surrounding areas, to actually kill the person who is understood to be a witch. Increasingly due to the circulation and access of small arms, sometimes people are now hired to do that for community members or for families, but this sort of understanding of popular justice comes from an awareness that it's sort of community oriented. It's to get justice for the community. It's not just individual revenge or something along those lines. So that I'll leave it at that as sort of contextualizing this chapter and providing a little bit more detail where the chapter is full of gaps.
Okay, Emily, I assume you want me to go ahead?
That's
okay.
Great. So Beth, take it away.
Okay, and first off, I want to apologize because for the first time ever, I have like a bee swarming in my office. And so I had to let the dog out because he was going after the bee. Now he's trying to come back in. So it's like a little bit of chaos, but hopefully I'll stay on focus. So I want to say, first off, so Holly, this is a fascinating project, totally beyond sort of anything that I focus on. And it did, so I originally got chapter 6, which I think some other people here also got and had read that. And then just the other day, you sent me chapter 2 to try to, and that was helpful to get a better understanding of some of the concepts and things like that. But then even having said that, a lot of my comments are it really helps to hear your summary of it now, sort of where it fits in the larger book project, because I wasn't getting all of that from the 2 chapters, right? And so take this all with a grain of salt then, because some of this you've addressed some. And I also thought it was, just chapter 6 in and of itself, like very rich with lots of quotes from interviews and personal stories. And so it sort of makes it interesting to read and get some of these cases that you're talking about. So I have, I guess, maybe 6 or 7 questions or points sort of, and I do have them written out and I can send them to you, Holly, so don't worry about like furiously taking notes or anything like that. And the first is sort of broadly sort of like, what is this core argument and where does this fit in it? So you've covered that some now, but it's still, I may push you a little bit further on some of it. And that's particularly, you mentioned several of these concepts that you have, that you develop, they're sort of in italics in the text, and they stand out. And so you have the disconnect between harm naming, the contradictory consciousness, informed disenchantment, different justice logics, emergent hybrid legality, right? There's lots of these, and it can get a little bit confusing, even with the chapter 2 too. And some of them you're sort of building on work from other authors. Others seem to be more your contribution, but I feel like it might help to streamline and sort of focus on ones that are really your contribution. And because just again, I was only reading, one chapter fully, and the other one sort of looking through some of those things, and it gets a bit confusing with all of these. But the overall theme seems to be, as you sort of mentioned, this tension between the state-based justice mechanisms and traditional popular justice mechanisms. And there's obviously a rich literature on which to draw in this regard. And I'm assuming that you probably do that, some other places within the book project. So, but one thing that jumped out at me right away was sort of there's also there's traditional justice mechanisms, but there's also the manipulation of those traditional justice mechanisms, as with, for example, the Gacaca courts in Rwanda or something like that. And so I'll come back to that a little bit more later on. But I think what I wasn't getting fully from this chapter, and again, might be where you're going with the chapter in the book, is sort of what are the implications of this tension, this disconnect? What are the results of this, or how does this help us better understand something, sort of moving forward? And so I was thinking, particularly, like I was thinking about Peter Eke's classic article, I think it's 1975, Nigerian political scientist, about the two publics. And so he talks about the civic public and the primordial public. Those are his terms that he uses, and sort of how the African bourgeoisie, African elite are caught between these. And he, describes sort of where their loyalties lie, right? The civic public is this public that's been imposed from outside. It's these institutions of the state that came with colonialism and were inherited in the post-colonial era, versus the primordial public, which is the traditional, ethnic organization and other things through kinship networks. And so African elites are caught between them. And he then uses this tension, right? He says, okay, the implications of this are that it basically is acceptable to steal from the civic public in order to enrich or contribute to or assist or help the primordial public, right? Which sort of helps understand then what some might call corruption and things like that, right? And so this is, but it's sort of that taking that next step of what are the implications of this tension? Now, from what I heard and what you were just talking about, you're getting more towards that in terms of why these external interventions don't work, and that then connects directly to my next point, which I was also thinking as I read this about Séverine Autesserre's great work on Congo, more recently, obviously much more recently than the 1975 article I was just mentioning, on sort of peace efforts in Congo, having focused on relations at the top and power sharing and negotiations, and let's get the president and the 4 rebel leaders to be vice president, and like everybody will be happy and everybody will get along. And obviously that didn't work. And a lot of her argument is sort of that you need to be paying more attention to local level grievances and access to land and justice and all sorts of things going on at the local level. And that you really can't find peace until you address that as well. Now I have an ongoing debate with one of my co-authors, because he sort of thinks he doesn't fully buy into the bottom-up approach, but I still think, it's the combination thereof, right? The top-down and the bottom-up and things like that. So I think I guess that's ultimately where one of those questions was sort of just, how do all these concepts help us better understand something, right? And it sounds like that's some of where you're going, but it wasn't entirely coming through in the chapter as it was now. So another thing that was sort of, again, where does this chapter fit? But I guess more specifically, the title of the chapter is Popular Justice, but when you introduced it here, you said Witchcraft and Popular Justice, which then maybe adjust some of my comments coming up, because you say that it's about popular justice, but then you really focus on the witchcraft aspect of it, which you say is sort of an emphasis of the large portion of the popular justice cases. But I also was wondering sort of about the use of popular justice in non-witchcraft situations, right? And is that happening? Is this, what some would call vigilantism happening in other forms. I certainly, the context of which I'm aware in Tanzania and Kenya, you do see this. And so I'm wondering, what are the other types of situations where, non-witchcraft situations where this is being used, and what are the harms and disconnect and harm naming and things that's happening there. And so I was sort of curious about more broadly, not just in those situations of witchcraft. The third thing was sort of how new is this situation? Is it especially relevant now? What is the role of the conflict? So trying to get a sense, and again, you address this some, one of the things you talk about in chapter 6 is the increased access to weapons. And that's presumably because of recent conflicts. So I'm wondering, is this reliance on popular justice driven in part by the fact that people have weapons and they thus feel sort of empowered to go take action in their, take justice into their own hands in a way that they might not have in the past? Or does this relate to sort of that idea of top down versus bottom up? And because the top down peace building and conflict resolution and stuff hasn't focused on some of these local level grievances, that's where the disconnect is. It would help to sort of know more about whether this is increasing now, and if that's happening, then is it because of recent events, or how does this fit into the conflict situation and other things that have happened recently? You talked about justice for sexual violence and things like that, which has obviously been a big focus, but it would, and again, this may be something you address elsewhere in the book, right? So I'm just sort of basing it on what I could see there. So those were the three broader points I had. And then I had a few smaller ones. Emily, how are we doing on time? Am I okay? I know you said you were going to be strict, so I want to make sure I'm not getting my knuckles, Okay, so as I was reading some of these stories, I sort of thought, is it justice or is it revenge? And is there a difference? And even, these cases, again, were all related to witchcraft. But thinking again beyond witchcraft, is it, what happens is somebody is infertile and they blame, several of the examples are related to infertility, and they blame somebody else, and and they blame for witchcraft, and that I'm curious about that relationship between justice and revenge. Are they different things? Are they two sides of the same coin? Do people perceive them differently from one another? And somehow justice is justified and revenge is somehow not. So I'm curious a little bit about that, that dynamic. Another one is, I was just thinking about there's so much room for that. I mean, having done my research in Western Tanzania, my dissertation research in Western Tanzania and the refugee affected areas, the spread of rumors all the time, and just there's so much room for this, for rumors and false accusations. And there would appear to me to be a lot of room for abuse of popular justice mechanisms, perhaps going back to my previous question about revenge. And so I guess I think you take it at face value a lot, but this, I could see you problematizing this a lot more, right? And the potential for, I fully understand why you're saying, listen, witchcraft exists. This is in people's reality, and thus, but there does seem to be some room for some problematizing. What are the risks of that, placing such faith in that, and then placing such faith in popular justice as the way to address it. I would love to see more quotes. You do have one quote or story that's repeated, and I think that's just because you're chopping and pasting and moving. Obviously, you don't want to have it, but also then more explanation, about. A lot of your quotes are sort of longer, stories. And then I think it would be really helpful to tease those out more. What are the implications? How do they connect to those specific concepts, right? Because I think making that connection, how is this specifically an example of, harm naming or things like that, I think would be really good. And especially more examples of popular justice. And again, going back to not just witchcraft, but beyond, again, that's sort of your decision as to whether you want to focus only on witchcraft or bring that more broadly. And then I guess I had two more points, sorry. But so on page 25, you're talking about the police response, or at least page 25. And this is what you said. You said, the state typically intervenes through police officers to protect the witch. However, these interventions rarely occur in time to save the witch. Instead, what typically happens is they intervene too late or only in time to save the witch's life, not her reputation. So I was trying to make sense of this, right? Like, and sort of like, how would an earlier response help save the reputation and the life, right? And what would that response be? What could police do? How do they save her reputation? And should they be stopping popular justice? But doesn't that then contribute to this feeling of a disconnect between state-based and traditional justice, right? And so like that, there was so much loaded in that statement, like, they intervened too late or only in time to save the witch's life, not her reputation. And I was just imagining, like, what would the appropriate intervention be, or what are you recommending there, right? Like what would you tell the police they should do when they get this accusation of witchcraft and things like that? So I was intrigued by that. For some reason, I really latched onto that little description there, because that was yeah, I didn't know how to make sense of it. And then, my last point is sort of, what is the role of science? Like, and obviously I think we need to be careful, because distrust of science is not just an African thing. We see that like abundantly clear here, right? And so that's but I do like, things like the infertility stories, like eventually one of the couples gets pregnant, for example. So apparently it wasn't a witch who had cursed them and things like that. And so, but like, at what point is, what is the role of sort of, Western science? What is the role of other types of science, right? Like, and how, can evidence, however that is gathered, somebody getting pregnant or whatever, like, can that undermine any of these accusations? Because I certainly feel, fortunately, I don't have a lot of friends on Facebook who are the, non-science believers, but there does seem to be a population here that, regardless of evidence, will never believe it, right? And so I guess I'm wondering about that dynamic in this context as well. So anyway, I thought it was really interesting to read. Like, there's a lot there, and it sounds like from what you've described, there's like, the larger book project addresses a bunch of these. So again, as I said before, take it with a grain of salt, but that's where, as I was reading the chapter, those were some of the things that came up to me as questions. So.
That's great. So that's a lot to work with. And I also just wanted to remind, I should have said this at the beginning, but for people who are getting comments on their papers, we are recording these sessions. So you'll be able to listen to it and
awesome,
verse yourself in the feedback. Holly, do you want to respond to any of the points that Beth raised? I'll give you, a few minutes to do that before we open it up for more questions.
Yeah, I'm so glad again that I got to participate in this, because your comments are really helpful for a number of reasons. One reason is a little bit more context on the chapter. This was originally about a 60 or 70 page chapter that addressed a number of the things that you brought up. So you're making me rethink, like, what are the most meaningful aspects of witchcraft and popular justice to bring together in this chapter to really highlight the points I want to make in the book more broadly. So, for example, I think that, other situations of popular justice being used are with repeat offenders. And this connects to the disconnect with the justice system, because, kind of ironically, the reason that these repeat offenders get targeted with popular justice is because the legal system arguably actually works, because they are being prosecuted according to the law of the country, right? And so they're given their sentence or their fine or whatever it may be, and then they're released once they've served their sentence or paid their fine, right? And the population doesn't see that as fair. It's not enough. It's not strict enough, right? But the legal system is actually functioning according to how it should. So I think, you're mentioning that it would be interesting to hear other cases of popular justice. Bringing that back in might be useful in terms of highlighting this really the disconnect with the justice system and people's perceptions of what justice looks like. And then so that's sort of one thing. And the other thing that you mentioned that I cut from the chapter is all this stuff on rumors, accusations, gossip, everything like that, because yes, that's a huge part of it. And I cut it because while that is a part of it, right, that wasn't sort of the part that I was focusing on with this disconnect. At the same time, I have everything I cut, I've put into the beginnings of a complete other paper that I would publish on this, because there's a lot of also higher level politicization of witchcraft accusations related to churches and leaders of churches in power, and accusing those who sort of are within the church but going against them of witchcraft. And so really localized power dynamics being sort of channeled through witchcraft accusations, and some of those resulting in popular justice. And I had one case where I got to like extensively interview the family members of a woman who had to flee to a different part of the country because of this sort of situation where it's very politicized. So those are definitely all a part of my data, my findings, and now it's just thinking through, like rethinking the chapter from the bottom up, if you will, and what's really going to contribute to the broader arguments I'm making. So I think I'll leave it at that, but I do want to say also in relation to science, right? The reason that mediation sometimes work is mediators can play that sort of middle role where they recognize and believe in witchcraft, but they also have access to more information about sort of medical sciences. And so they can say, you know, well, this infertility situation may be, you know, actually biological or physical or whatever it may be. At the same time, they recognize that largely the population in Uvira doesn't have access to that same type of information, or it hasn't been internalized in the same way. So they have to translate that information in a way that makes sense to the people they're working with. And so they do that by saying, well, this is not a case of witchcraft. We're not challenging witchcraft as, you know, a way of understanding the world, but this particular case, yeah. So yeah, science it's interesting. And then the other way that I see science playing out, right, is this sort of scientific rationality of the legal system, where that is what's disconnected from the population. And this was said so many times, and a number of the quotes are in the chapter, right? There's no proof, the legal system can't do anything because there's no proof. And that's really, you know, it's so interesting doing this research, because you hear or the sort of international community's expectation that the population doesn't know the law, right? But there are those aspects of the law that everybody knows and they can cite to you, and the fact that there's no proof of witchcraft, that's one of those things. So that's another area. But I thank you so much. I think I'm left not necessarily with a clear way forward, but a recognition that everything I had is stuff that I need to go back to and sort of rework. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much, Beth. I really appreciate it.
Let's open up the floor to other comments and feedback for Holly in the time that we have. I'm going to give us I'm going to give us about 15 minutes for that. Okay. Does anyone have anything they want to add to this? I do. I was trying to wait though, because I think I didn't want to jump in. I'm looking at my notes though. I think what I have to say is more feedback about what I think is the most important contribution of this section that I would like to see you pull out as a reader, and as someone who is also, as you know, Holly, really interested in scholarship on justice and law, and how people think about the relationship between justice and law. Mm-hmm. I think that the work that you're doing on harm naming, I think the harm naming is actually something that I think you've got something there, and I would love to see that developed as both a as like almost as a technique, but also it's like a technique of justice, right? Is the harm naming, but also I would love to see you discuss in more detail how different constituents recognize or give value or credence to different kinds of harms. And if you notice any changes, like if you notice any changes over time or in context over which harms are given more weight than others. That to me seems like one of the big interventions that you're making. And then the other thing I was thinking about was this discussion about damages that you addressed a little bit in your comments, that there's something going on here. The reason the law is not just is because those who are perceived to have been harmed get no damages, right? So there's more, I think there's more here for you to say and to unpack about that category of restitution. And this is why a jail sentence does nothing for someone. And I'm thinking about other work in African legal history. Like I'm thinking about, I think I brought her up last time we were talking about this, so forgive me, Liz Thornberry's book, Colonizing Consent. She talks about this a lot in her work, that if people, like a jail sentence doesn't do enough to actually correct both sides of the ledger, and that people are seeking damages. That was something I thought you could pull out more. That's all for now.
So just one quick response, which also addresses one of Beth's comments as well, to a certain extent, is sort of, or I guess sort of riffing on things that you both mentioned. Why witchcraft in a post-conflict? What's sort of the link here? And Emily, you may remember from the chapter we discussed last year, looking at sort of statutory rape and this sort of mobilization around sexual and gender-based violence, and how that fits with both these discussions of harm naming and different logics of justice. One of the things that, I mean, really the topic of witchcraft emerged solely from my fieldwork. I had no like preconceived thoughts that I'm going to engage with witchcraft in any way, or popular justice really, or anything along those lines. But one of the reasons that it did is because this is one of the areas that local NGOs have really started emphasizing, because that is something that international funders of local NGOs have sort of heard about and, taken off on, popular justice and, witch killing and all these things, and these human rights abuses that are happening against people who are accused of being witches. And so that is in terms of, why this type of harm now. I think there's a number of reasons, and there's other research that highlights sort of the disruption in the traditional authority structures in post-conflict Congo. And I think that is a part of it, because historically the Mwamis of the region, the local kings or sort of tribal leaders, would be the ones to deal with cases of witchcraft. And so I spoke extensively with the local Mwami, and he just does not do that anymore. So that was sort of historically a sense of protection for the population. Not that he would necessarily punish them, but he sort of had control over witches, or at least that's what the population understood to be happening. And now sort of in the post-conflict context, right, with so many disruptions to different historically important ways of doing authority for the population, that's been sort of displaced, but it hasn't been picked up by the state. So when we think about other sorts of harms and things, the state may have picked them up in ways that are disconnected from the population, but they're addressing those other harms or grievances. Whereas with witchcraft, it just seems to be this thing that's been left without any real sense for the local population of how to deal with it, or what they should be doing to deal with it. Other than, this lack of recognition by the state. And so if I look sort of temporally and why this is becoming really a salient issue now, I would say that sort of combination of factors is a part of the reason, and doesn't necessarily answer the question fully, but sort of addresses a few different points there.
Veronica here. That was quite an interesting presentation, but I'm also interested in the aspect of witchcraft and justice, because I do recognize that many African governments, in terms of their constitutions, they do not recognize witchcraft. So it's not really, it's not popularly accepted, but of course, it's really popular among many African communities. But in the communities that you're really discussing, how do they determine, how do they actually, what are the evidence that is really gathered to address these issues and also to support the claims that, these are witchcrafts? And then what is being done by the communities as well as by the state?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So again, there is this disruption where historically cases would be brought to the Mwami, and according to my interviews with him, he had sort of a panel of people who were experts in this and would determine if the individual was a witch through various tests. Now that's not really done anymore. So the different levels of evidence really vary. Some, going back to the point I was making with Beth, right? Some of this is just rumors and accusations. And Beth brought up the case of Gachacha, right? Where lots of revenge accusations and that type of thing. Well, similarly with witchcraft, there would be a lot of, well, your goat ruined my garden, so you are a witch, etc. But also, and in one of the cases I sort of elaborate in the chapter, people will go to, for a lack of a better translation, witch doctors, go to people who are understood to be able to determine these things. Now, I didn't personally speak to any of these witch doctors. And to be honest, when people would start talking about witchcraft with me, they would often make sort of subtle statements about how, if I was asking about this, I was probably going to be perceived as being a witch or sort of in cahoots with witches. And it got kind of to a point where there was a bit of a safety issue in terms of how much do I want to get into this with the sorts of perceptions and possible rumors that are going to circulate around that. But from what people told me of their individual experiences in terms of being concerned as being victims of witchcraft and sort of broader just norms, is that people who are really serious or really concerned will go to a witch doctor, and they will invariably essentially tell you that somebody's a witch and who that person is. So I would say, according to legal standards, obviously these would not be sufficient ways of providing evidence or proof of witchcraft, but people do believe them. And in the story of Naima that I shared in the chapter, I mean, she abandoned her whole life, her and her husband, to move because 3 of her children had been killed as a result of witchcraft. And a fetisher or a witch doctor determined that it was a relative who was doing this. And so they just abandoned everything. So there is, that real sort of impact in people's belief systems that result in major changes for their lives.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This is Cal. A very quick question. I was actually kicked out by my internet halfway through, so you may have already covered this. But is there, I heard Beth discussing emergent legality and the concept of emergent legality, and I hear you talking a lot about different logics of justice, many logics, plural. And so I'm wondering, is there a logic of justice that is part of that emerging legality? Is there a way to codify it, or is there a heuristic that can help us to codify what is emerging out of the situation, or is it just meant to be understood as a pluralized sense of justice? So
yeah, thank you. Throughout the book, and again, this goes to one of Beth's comments, which I totally agree with, and that there's a lot of concepts floating around that I'm like, but so this sort of addresses that, but there are also different themes of emergent hybrid legality that I am developing. So for example, one of them is this idea that you know, people refer to or cite the law or respect the law, but not the legal system. So they turn to mediation while embracing the law itself. So things like that, that would be sort of one theme of this emergent form of legality. And it's a great question, Cal, because when I was reviewing the chapter right before this, I was like, is popular justice a form of emergent hybrid legality? Like what is hybridized about it? Where does the law come in? Is it just because the law is lacking that this then becomes sort of an emergent form of legality? And, you know, we wouldn't typically think of it as legality because, you know, from the state legal system or from like a Western legal approach, right, it would be viewed as extra legal, not a form of legality. So it's a great question. That in this particular chapter is something I'm still working through, and I'm open to any sorts of thoughts or comments about that as well. But yes, there are other themes of emergent hybrid legality in the book that emerge.
All right. I think we're out of time. I want to keep us moving, but this was really generative, Holly, and we're excited to see what you do with your project. And we're proud that it has a Circassian imprint on it.
It definitely does. It definitely does over the past years. Thank you so much to everyone, and especially Beth, for your comments. I really appreciate it. I look forward to hearing about the other two papers. And I have a new puppy who's been crying for the past 20 minutes. So I'm going to run and take her out. But I'll be jumping right back in. And I look forward to hearing about the other papers. So thank you, everyone, very much.
It's a really interesting project. We look forward to seeing how it comes together. So.
All right, everyone. I'm gonna get us going since most of us are back, and the two important players in this next session are here. So this next paper is by Amson Hagen, PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology at UNC Chapel Hill. And the title of Amson's paper is Enduring Temporalities of Material Non-Movement: Waithood and Waiting for COVID-19 Vaccines in Africa. And our discussant is Brenda Chalfin, Professor of Anthropology and Director of the Center for African Studies at Florida, University of Florida. So Amson, do you want to begin by giving us a little bit of a situating? What is this paper to you, and where do you want to take it?
Sure. Hi, everyone. This paper has been something I've been thinking about, or this topic is something I've been thinking about for the past year or so. It is loosely and tangentially related to my dissertation work, and I spent from 2019 to 2020, about 12 months in Niger doing ethnographic work with unauthorized migrants in Niamey, and also in Agadez, the small town, the southern fringe of the Sahara there. And as I was leaving, or at least the last couple months of my stay and study there, there was a lot of, I could tell, a palpable sort of increase in sort of these bio precautions people were taking, both in the capital, but specifically in the migrant camp that I was working in. I saw a lot more face masks the last couple weeks I was there. There were a lot more jokes people were making about, as you can imagine, migrants from all over West and Central Africa bringing in COVID to Niger. So there was a lot more discussion about this. And I came back to the US in March, and sort of, everything, or whatever everything is, started to become more apparent, in the sort of fear mongering and fear legitimately that took place in the US and elsewhere sort of rose to a crescendo, multiple crescendos over the past few months. There were a lot of stories, as I'm sure most of us, probably all of us, may have heard or read in the news about, in the early summer, like April 2020, like why isn't Africa showing these sorts of signs that we're seeing in the West? Why, what's special there? And I think it was at that point I started to think about, okay, there's a lot happening in terms of like testing and in terms of like, quote unquote, measuring the disease or measuring the preponderance or the sort of manifestation of COVID in Africa as opposed to everyone else. And so you easily see a division between Africa and the West, right? And one that's been sort of replayed over and over again for centuries. And so it wasn't a coincidence that that bifurcation played out. And as we've moved on from purely testing for COVID-19 to focusing on vaccines, I think the earlier questions and sort of thoughts I had about this idea of Africa being different and, recapitulating the notion that there's a biological difference between quote unquote Black Africans or Africans and the West or other people in the world. The vaccine sort of discussion has sort of dominated, and understandably so, this sort of global discussion on COVID and the idea of a pandemic, what that means. Are we all in this together? And I've been focusing on a little bit writing about the narrative of the vaccine rollout or vaccine marketplace, vaccine distribution, vaccine allocation, and all of these sorts of ways of sort of distributing or moving vaccines as not just a material product, but as almost like a metaphysical artifact of Western imperialism and domination. As that moves around the world, I've really been interested in why it's moving in the way that it's moving, and why it hasn't moved to certain places, at least not as quickly or as robustly. And that place, considering it's mostly sub-Saharan Africa or Africa at large. And so I started thinking about this idea of movement differently from my project, which is about African peoples moving around the world, or specifically within Africa, and that being a problem for Europe and America in general, to focusing on the idea that these materials aren't moving. One of the things that I've heard for years is that it's much easier for Africans to send money around the world than it is for Africans to actually move around the world. And there's something, it's interesting thing to think about here, where vaccines are in a sense moving. Here I'm in Maryland, and every day I'm getting text messages from the county executive here or the governor or whatever, emails about how Maryland, we just bought a new batch of vaccines, or New Jersey just bought a new batch of vaccines, or or Texas. There's all this movement that's, again, so easily happening for not just the US, but like particular US states and cities as well. I've read about this sort of public advertisement about the nation state's ability to take care of its systems elsewhere, in terms of like France saying, hey, we bought new vaccines, they're good, you should take them, because there are a lot of French, there's stuff happening in France, but the UK, there's all this trying to convince the population that we're doing our best, and we're trying really, really hard, but there's not really discussion about how like this marketplace in of itself is really strange in a global pandemic to force people to pay at differential rates, but that this marketplace isn't equitable because not every country has access to it. And so I've been thinking about that, and really trying to think about what it means, or what a pandemic actually means in this sense. Again, in that sort of humanist logic, we're all in this together. But when it comes to, that's usually steeped in the idea of how we experience the disease at the same time. And we're all equally afraid of it or fearful of what, not just what it does to, humans, but also what it does to economies. So that's a palpable fear that I think has been shared across the world and is inclusive of Africa in a sense. But the vaccine or the vaccination rollout across the world has made me think about how, the Africa in a particular sense is like only sort of involved or like on an equal playing field in a sense with other nations when it comes to disease, but when it comes to treatment and cure, treatment and care, it's on a completely different geography and temporality. And so I've been thinking about this paper that I think you've read a little bit, Dr. Chalfin, has been me thinking back into this temporality. Why is Africa, generally speaking, why is Africa sort of placed behind the West when it comes to receiving vaccines, or why is there a line to begin with? I actually don't interrogate this question, but that's something to think about. But why is there a line? Why is there a queue? And why has Africa and for the most part the global South in general always been in the back? And I think that's more of it's more than a rhetorical question, because one can easily say, oh, it's colonialism, but why is that particular temporal arrangement so enduring, especially now, given we're in a pandemic where we're all COVID's everywhere. It's non-discriminatory. You hear these things. And that's a general sort of epidemiological sort of speak where, well, it doesn't care about your skin color or nationality, it'll still kill you. It's sort of like, not quite. So that's generally where this sort of thought has been nagging me for about a year. So I decided to try and write something about it. And I don't think it'll be a dissertation chapter, and I'm fine with that. And as an anthropologist, I've definitely spent a lot of time writing something that has very little ethnographic, I guess, data. And I do have a little bit that I might add later, but most of those are conversations and basically people expressing their fears in Niger about this particular thing. And there's some Twitter discourses I've been sort of involved in with some East African sort of expressing that they have no interest in taking the vaccine because the Europeans don't want it. So there's a whole little thing there. But again, that's another, it's just a temporality. It's like, well, if Europe wants it again first, then maybe we could take it later. So anyway, that's maybe a longer explanation of what I've been thinking through of this paper. Thank you.
That's helpful, Amson. Brenda Chalfin, I'll turn things over to you to offer your comments to Amson before we jump into discussion.
Sure. Well, thanks, Emily and Chris and the whole Cirrus team. I also want to say a special hello to colleagues at USF who might not know us at UF. So please do reach out, because we have resources and we want to get to know you, and we'd love for you to come and share your work and be part of our center. Let me turn to Amson's paper, which was a short paper, and it's obviously a first cut, and it's full of some really probing questions and some very good ideas. And I think, as Amson himself said, there needs to be a little more evidence and data, but the framing is really provocative. So this is a paper that's interrogating Africa's limited access to the COVID vaccine. And it really makes an argument that these uneven flows of pharmaceuticals are just symptomatic of the continued racialization of global drug markets, which pathologize certain populations and locations as just as not a priority. And there's a particular argument where there's a parallel between the constrained mobility of Africans and the constrained mobility of these life-saving COVID vaccines. So Amson writes, African nations being kept out of the global market for vaccines and forced to wait for the West to have leftovers or wait for Western countries to donate vaccines is a consequence of the continuation of colonial racist aggression and attitudes towards Africa. So there's definitely a lot packed in here. think the thing that really strikes me the most is the way you speak about waithood. And there's prolonged waiting, the way we're all stuck together waiting, yet we all wait differently. And you also remind us, here we are kind of that 1-year anniversary, that this waiting is not some kind of time out, but it's really a period of long and painful transition. And there's both a shifting of routines and a hardening of certain kinds of boundaries and barriers. So I think you're touching on that. You're also speaking to just the whole question of timing and temporality and how much that matters to the human condition, including the conditions of global capitalism, despite all of these facile claims about globalization and time space compression, all of that old globalization speak. You're like, no, this temporality is different and it's particular. And I think that's also an important message because oddly enough, during this time of waiting, there's been so much discussion of fluidity, like our nimble transformations, like, oh, how we were able to work from home and teach our kids. And, you know, even this discussion, you know, the lightning speed of the vaccine rollout, you know, just kind of unending praise for that fluidity. But you're really saying what are the impediments and the kind of stuckedness there. You also speak in interesting ways to the kinds of hope and desire and all of these expectations about inclusion, which is very much along the lines of Berlant and these ideas of kind of cruel optimism that are a part of this era. And as you just mentioned, that provocatively, you are reconsidering the supposed dichotomization, right? Between the free flow of goods to and from the continent versus the highly controlled or contained mobilities of people. So in the case of the COVID vaccine, we see how the mobility of things, namely these life-saving drugs, is also constrained. And so I think this really causes us to complicate that presumed dichotomy. And I think the element that you inject there, where there's lots of room to probe that, is what other questions might we ask about life and mobility, right? What life-saving goods and services can and can't move? And even if you think about the laboring bodies and those that must wait and those that can move, you can think about the nurses and kind of health professionals, but nurses in particular, who have a kind of open door. So I think you're complicating that dichotomy, but on this particular register about kind of life and life saving. And I think that's really worth probing. You might take a look at an older piece by Michael Fisher in the Annual Review of Anthropology. It's on emergent forms of life. And it's subtitled Anthropologies of Late and Postmodernity. So it's ages old, it's 1999. But maybe there's a way to get back into that. Okay. And in your paper, which is just, you know, a first cut, a draft, you do have a long section on pathologizing Africa and how the inherent racism of the global order turns Africa and Africans into kind of second or third class global citizens. And I think those are kind of broad brushstrokes of why, and you did just mention that kind of why question. But how do we really dig down and get into the how? Because the how is where it really happens, right? And who is to blame? Is it countries? Is it persons? Is it pharmaceutical giants? Is it some abstraction that we call the market? And the devil is definitely in those details. It's also in the details of the temporality. And one thing about COVID and the vaccine, this is a rapidly unfolding situation. I know that our lives have been in slow motion, but the global distribution of drugs is going to look very, very different 6 months from now. Just imagine how things were 6 months ago, right? September, we had no idea that a viable, Trump was making all these promises, but would a viable vaccine really be available? So what will things look like 6 months down the road? And it sounds like you're busy writing a dissertation, but as a sideline project to really watch this and to look at the supply lines would be quite fascinating. So in terms of those empirics, I think you should keep a very close eye on the WHO COVAX program, right? So this is all about ensuring access to vaccines worldwide through drug distribution as well as localized manufacturing. So, this is all unfolding right now. And there's several matters at stake. Not that I'm making excuses, but there is the particular difficulty of mobilizing the Pfizer vaccine across the supply chain because of refrigeration demands. And I think that with the J&J vaccine, distribution is going to ramp up exponentially. Merck is manufacturing for them. It's stable at all temperatures. It's a 1 dose. I think this is a game changer. And it's fascinating to me in terms of like these fits and starts of what's going on. We were all madly rushing. Could we get Pfizer? We were so thrilled to get Pfizer. Now FEMA is vaccinating in Jacksonville. USF people, if you can't get to Tampa, get up to Jacksonville, and they're giving out the J&J vaccine. And almost everyone I know wants that vaccine, especially because it's supposed to be better in Africa. So yeah, things are changing, and they're going to change in front of our eyes. There's also, of course, just that breakdown. Africa, which nations, which regions, and where the relations and access is going to be different. Where we're going to have kind of a francophone distribution system and an anglophone distribution system, and there are also other supply lines, south-south supply lines. So China is producing, India is producing, and there's also quite a bit of African pharmaceutical capacity that we shouldn't overlook. South Africa in particular was very involved in making antiretrovirals and getting drug patents. So, I think stuff is really going to happen. So I think you're onto something very interesting and very important. So along these lines, Chris Peterson's work on speculative markets, drug circuits, and speculative life in Nigeria. I don't know if you know that book. So we might ask, how is the management and treatment of COVID in Africa? How does it compare to other drug circuits? She looks at antiretrovirals. There's also a lot of discussion of antibiotics and even, the flooding of the market of all of these pharmaceuticals. Another thing to take up in terms of kind of traction for further thought is the work of Collier and Lakoff on emergency and preparedness and kind of biopreparedness. Their work is mostly focused on the US. And so I think there's something to be taken from them, but you could also do quite an interesting critique because I don't think they really look at the unevenness of the market, right? Like preparedness, you just go out and buy it. But in this pandemic, couldn't even get the mask, let alone the ventilators. So the market in pandemics may be kind of a new issue for us to think about. So I'm also curious just about WHO and how it's handled its own preparedness in other epidemics or pandemics. So most recently, besides COVID, we've got Ebola. And WHO was really, taken to task for their unresponsiveness. But at a certain point, they did get their act together. And by the way, a lot of people in Congo were able to get their vaccine. So what's that about? Kind of where is WHO going? And I also would look, this is, if we could do all these things, but as even like a consortium of researchers where you could really get African colleagues involved, is what's going on a country basis? What kinds of commissions, what kinds of experts, what other kinds of interest groups are informing the policy to enable drug mobility? You use the term bioprecaution, and that would be very, very interesting. Certainly there can be lots of conspiracy theories. We know that they're out there, but there are also, as you've mentioned in your paper, raced bodies are part of this, right? And race bodies are understood to have certain capacities and vulnerabilities and all sorts of, and availabilities, et cetera. And I think you could probe that even on the national level of different policies. And again, this bigger question, how do states take care of their biosystems, right? How do they enter into particular markets? And again, you were just talking about the vaccine, and how does the vaccine itself, this even gets to the first paper, how does it embody different kinds of forces and relations? How do people think about that? So I'm also just thinking that soon enough, it's not going to be a scarcity issue in Africa. It's going to be a surplus issue. It's going to be an excess issue, which we know is the real problem, or one of the problems of pharmaceuticals in Africa. Markets get flooded with counterfeits, with expired things that are from all corners of the world. No one knows exactly when they were made. So rather than talking about this as kind of this indefinite suspension, I think there are going to be some very interesting rhythms and flows, and they're going to be contended with in different ways. I also think you might start putting these two sides of your paper together, because one side is about the status of migrants in the US or wherever, African migrants abroad in the time of the pandemic. So how do these different kinds of stuckedness or waitingness, how do they overlap and coincide? One conversation that I've had with colleagues and students who work on African migrants in the US is, for many migrants, maybe their life hasn't changed as much as non-migrants. They're already living in tight-knit communities. Like, they already had their pods, right? People already kept a low public profile for all sorts of reasons. And also people had their social life and all of their emotional ties that were expressed via all these digital and remote means anyway. But a lot of these migrants abroad in the US, they perform essential work. What kind of levels of infection? Can they receive treatment? Can they send resources home? Can they receive vaccines? Are they considered members of the so-called herd? Are they or are they treated as exceptional in some way along the lines of someone like Agamben? So anyway, those are just a set of thoughts and responses. I think it's a really, really interesting question. I think it's a very big question, but a valuable one. And as you, or if you could sort through the details, I don't think we might not see business as usual, right? Because these times of emergency are also times of transformation, and there's going to be new connections and new possibilities. There may be new, rules that are coming out of the WHO or the WTO about how drugs travel, et cetera, et cetera. So back to you, but thanks for sharing that, Amson.
That was great. Thank you so much, Brenda. Amson, throw it back. What was your, what do you get out of that feedback? Do you want to respond to the comments?
Yes. Yeah, I have a lot of work to do. This was definitely like a draft I kind of put together within a couple of days, and I was like, I'd initially sent it to Emily, and it was like, Amson's like too short. I was like, yeah, I know. So yeah, this is a lot of Professor Shalvin's comments are definitely making me think about this draft or whatever this ends up being in different ways. And one of the things that you mentioned was this sort of question of life, and something I'd been thinking about, and I had to write it down kind of scurrilously because it was really, it really struck me. And thinking about like these mobilities or the travel and movement of these life-saving drugs, right? What what we can, I guess we can say what it means for people in the West, what it means for people like in Europe or like in the US, but because there's an urgency there. It's a sort of an urgency to protect and ensure secure life, right? And that's sort of like enabled by the organization of this marketplace, whether it's the WHO COVAX or however else the US is like buying these sorts of things. And it's also sort of enacted by certain states to have their will be reflected in this marketplace. So again, there's like a circle there. And so, as this marketplace is sort of dictated on one end by, a certain group of actors, how, for example, or like why is the sort of the imperative to uphold life and to distribute these life-saving drugs to people throughout the global south and throughout Africa, like why is that not elicited the same sort of urgency from the marketplace, right? Why are the again, there's an issue with the marketplace and the idea of capitalism sort of dictating or mandating a sort of order of service. So think about this life forms, and I guess like, what does it mean to save African lives, right? And I know there's humanitarianism and development out here, but it's like, well, you could actually, one could provide a wonderful service to keep people alive like today, but that isn't something that is necessarily on the table, or at least it's debated, or, again, there are other things in place that, for instance, like Professor Chalfie, you mentioned like the WTO, and I'm really interested and I'm thinking about writing something about TRIPS legislation or trade related aspects of intellectual property rights. And actually India just recently, I think India had won a Supreme Court battle against Pfizer or something, or one of the companies, Moderna or Pfizer, to be able to reproduce the vaccine without some sort of, there's like an emergency label that had like a time limit on it, so they could only do so for a little bit of time. So they won. Goal is to, one, quickly vaccinate, population of over 1.1 billion people in India. But two, there's a market sort of imperative for India as well to be able to manufacture and distribute those drugs to their partners. So in a South-South partnership, for example, that could be pretty lucrative. And so TRIPS is one of these sorts of roadblocks where the West may say, well, we have to follow the rules. It's like, well, who enacted those rules? So these are this idea about, I'll check out Michael Fisher's work on emergent forms of life. That's pretty, that's something that I've been thinking about. And, again, I know in the paper that the draft that I sent, I did not name, except for a few instances, particular African nations. And I was sort of invoking, I guess, Africa as a particular gloss on this sort of temporally behind, space peoples and ideas as sort of like a mass unit. And I would definitely like to, for instance, I know a bit, I still get emails from Niger about their COVID testing statistics, and COVID vaccine sort of numbers and task forces and stuff. And so it's been interesting it might be interesting to say something about Niger, small population compared to a place like Nigeria. But I think I definitely would take up that issue and write more specifically about certain nations. And South Africa definitely rises to the sort of top of consciousness when it comes to what that country has been experiencing recently in terms of actually shutting down they had a major vaccination program that they actually shut down for a week or two. I don't know if they've resumed it yet, but that was a story about 2 weeks ago. And there are a few countries who have relatively robust vaccination programs. So Egypt and Morocco have pretty strong vaccination rates, and just they've been able to acquire vaccines in ways or at higher levels than compared to like Niger. So there's some interesting sort of country comparisons I could make within the sort of continent of Africa. And granted, all of those numbers pale in comparison to what France is doing. And the idea of France sitting on a stockpile of vaccines, well, there are lots of places that are within Africa that are underserved for vaccinations, or vaccines like Niger, or like Ghana. Interesting stuff happening in Ghana in terms of vaccines. So there's interesting sort of discrepancies there. Again, in this idea of the pandemic, not everything is equal. So that's, I do have a lot to think about, and I know this is definitely a side project, and I think the idea that things are fluid is also very interesting, because I mean, they're not for everyone or in all sort of aspects of life. And I will think more about what'll happen in the, I guess, relatively immediate future, as COVID-19 becomes, or all predictions state that it'll become endemic to the world, if not to particular regions. And what will that mean for once vaccination is not like will COVID-19 be like polio has been for the last 30 years in parts of Africa? Will it be relegated to that sort of status as a persistent sort of annoyance on the level of like the WHO and the world, as like, why are these countries not able to get rid of polio, right? Why are we still doing polio vaccinations in Cameroon in 2010? So that's something to think about in terms of pre-existing pharmaceutical infrastructures and abilities throughout the continent. That's something to think about too. And there are some, or Nigeria's got pharmaceutical capacity, and a few other states do. Kenya, for example, does, and then there are a lot of states that don't. So like Niger is not producing any vaccines. So those are definitely things I'd like to think about. And I am keen on keeping in mind this sort of, as much as there's like a global marketplace for vaccines, what that means for the world and Africa sort of at large, and what it means to depend on these smaller sort of pharmaceutical capacities of these countries compared to, the US or even like Maryland's ability to just buy 1 million of them, right? That's something that access and that speed are just completely different. And and that's really interesting to me.
Thank you, Amson. I'm going to open the floor for comments or other questions for Amson. Beth and Karen. Beth and then Karen. And am I missing anyone else? Maybe both of you can ask your questions or give your comments, and then Amson, you can respond after Beth and Karen speak. Okay.
So I just have a few little sort of think as you work on this, Amson, and think about this more, and keep in mind that I'm coming at this from the perspective of a political scientist, which is supposed to be one of the advantages of CSIROS, right? But I know that anthropologists don't always like the political science angle on things, so I apologize right there. But on this question of like different countries and sort of, I mean, because this is a fascinating thing playing out. I know Kenya has also started, Ghana, Kenya, Cote d'Ivoire, I think were the ones that started with the COVAX. But I also think it's really interesting to look at what's been going on in Tanzania. So in Tanzania, of course, Magufuli held a day of prayer at the end of April and prayed COVID away, and it's not a problem and they don't have it. And there's been a lot of concern about the fact that they aren't even pursuing vaccines, right? Like they aren't, and now apparently Magufuli has it, had a heart attack, had to be he was in the Nairobi hospital as of 2 days ago. I think he's now been taken to India. And so it may force them to obviously acknowledge that COVID does still exist, but I think you have that side of it as well, right? Which is interesting, not even pursuing the vaccines. They're also like, I think the geopolitics of this will be very interesting to study, right? Because you're totally right that there's this like focus on, the US first, or, like countries first in wanting to hoard all the vaccine. I think Canada has like reserved like 6 times their population or something like that. And it's, but I do think that that's creating an opening for, it's not only Western European and US companies that have developed vaccines, right? And so you have China and Russia, and they are seeing this as an opening to get involved more and more in Africa to provide their vaccines and things like that. And so how all that plays out, I think is going to be really fascinating to look at, because I think the US in particular is not thinking about the fact that this just gives, if we were already worried about Chinese influence in Africa, this is only going to increase it, and maybe Russia. So, but then I also wonder, like, where does the fact where in all of this narrative does the fact that there haven't been as many deaths and there haven't been, that sort of COVID certainly is a problem everywhere, but it hasn't been as deadly in many African countries. And there's a whole debate about the numbers, I understand, but there's also, more and more information coming out about the fact that basically countries with more obesity have had a lot worse experiences with COVID, and that perhaps, younger populations in Africa, less obesity, less diabetes, all of these things, maybe, so when you get to like vaccinating, like, I'm not trying to say that we shouldn't be, but if the priority is on places where it's actually you're getting hospitalization and deaths at a higher rate, then so what is the relationship between sort of the public health situation and the need for vaccination, I guess. Sorry, I'll shut up.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Beth. Let's move on to Karen, and then David, maybe we'll make sure you can get your comment in too, because I want to make sure we have enough time.
All right. Thank you. I'm Karen. I'm from University of Florida. Amson, this is a very interesting paper. And so I come from a global health, public health space. And so while you were talking, and also Dr. Shaflin kind of was going through the parts of your paper, I thought about equity, but then also this space of the narrative of when COVID started, and kind of this infographic that was published about the continent, which places in the world would be prepared to handle and it was in the Twitter sphere. I know you mentioned, so there's a lot of conversation, and from my end, my perspective was, this perception of Africa was expected to be bad. Africa, this narrative of the continent being the place where this would, the impact would be terrible, and but not the opposite in the sense that the resiliency to other shocks that they had experienced from colonial to now to different variants of different diseases, being able to actually listen to the science, where in the case of the US, that wasn't happening. And so I think that's that kind of leads into the now where we're at with, again, this narrative of, I think, what you were saying, people in Niger saying they wouldn't want to take it. And I think it comes back, for me, the conversation that has kind of started here in the US about the equity and access. So not necessarily like Black bodies not wanting to take the vaccine, or Black bodies saying definitely due to historical trauma and translational aspects of racism, and the testing of Black bodies, that hesitancy that is there, but there's also the equity and access. So if you live in different food deserts and you live in spaces where you don't have clinics, how's the information being relayed to you, and how are you receiving it, or where can you ask questions about the process of the vaccine creation? And so I think in the same sense, looking at that lens on the continent, not necessarily that, definitely, yes, we had those two French doctors talk about using the continent as this space to test. And so that already created that narrative, why, and that hesitancy, but also due to the inequity of getting information. And so how these states and these nations are communicating this information, and the inequity. So those who may be a higher income on the continent have easier access to the vaccine, in the case of Ghana, perhaps, or Senegal, where it might not go to the rural communities, but more so in the urban spaces, where that access and that information to having access to TV or radio, or how this information is being communicated, can also be a factor in the inequity. Even with the bigger picture of pharmaceuticals, I think the equity aspect also will play a role in terms of who, within the context of rural communities, where you can see that cases were perhaps not high in certain rural communities, but for instance, like Senegal, you didn't have many cases in rural spaces, but more in Dakar. And so who gets access to those vaccines, and how equitable, not just in terms of access, but information, I think is something that you can definitely explore. And also, the narrative in that, it might not get worse, or it didn't get worse on the continent. And maybe it's due to the fact that, individuals listen to the science because they've had Ebola, they've had other shocks where that protective factor of protecting their family comes into play in their community. But then also the exhaustion that they may also have experienced because of, if the economy in which they work, it's not as structured. It's informal economies. And so those are the things that were the hardships for them. But being able to wear a mask, also the heat and all these other barriers, but also still listening to the science. I think that flipping and looking at the opposite end of that narrative in the sense of not wanting to take the vaccine, but the inequity and maybe that information. I hope I was clear, but these were the spaces in terms of even here in the US, looking at the inequity of Black bodies, not necessarily saying they don't want to take the vaccine. It's just really how is it being communicated, and that hesitancy due to how Black bodies, not only here on the in the US, but on the continent have been used in science, from Tuskegee to gynecology. So I think that would be an interesting space to look at.
Can I just get in for 1 minute, please?
Who is that?
Veronica.
Oh, Veronica. Veronica, we don't have a lot of time and David's been waiting. David, do you have a quick question or a question that you want to pose? And then Veronica.
Sure. I'll be quick. The comment. Thank you for your presentation. I wanted to note, though, that something I'd been read recently was connected to the work is the part of the genome sequencing is identified that there's a particular haplotype that is a part of the biological response that leads to the inflammatory response to the introduction of the pathogen in individuals' bodies, and inflammation is the general systemic inflammation is the in most every case the mortality, the mortality, but that particular haplotype that causes the body's overreaction is something that the population of sub-Saharan Africa is apparently it's absent from. So it's a natural, not a defense, but absence of vulnerability through the means the way this particular virus can cause its worst outcomes, which means counting clearly, as others have noted, it continues to be an issue in every country, but the likeliest outcome for populations and individuals without this particular variation in their genome, they're likeliest to have that mild to asymptomatic response. That being the case, and these were, I can send you the references to the Nature and the these are guys out of Leipzig and the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences with the last couple of publications about the specific genome. If that's of interest, I can send that along. But connect the issue that it would be connected that I see that might impact the population in the countries being referenced is that without exposure to the very bad, those cases where you have two people side by side that are seemingly exactly alike, and that one person dies and the other has no indications of a sickness, but you have an entire population where the worst expression of an infection is a sneeze and a slight flu-like kind of thing. Does demand for the vaccine that we're discussing access and equitable distribution, does demand among the population Do they care if they have access if they're not seeing, if individuals don't see the bad outcomes, they don't care about the vaccine itself, would rather just have the naturally generated immune response to it. And then does this become a discussion that is just removed from the practical side of things, the discussion amongst folk that it doesn't really involve. It's about people that couldn't, we don't care if we have, in other words, we don't care if we have access to the vaccine. Why are you all focused on that? We've got other issues. I mean, as you're saying with polio, part of the thing that was driving the reference to polio, even when you see, most recently, speaking of somebody in Zambia, actually Zambia and in Uganda, you see people that have those permanent impacts of the neurodegenerative issues associated with a polio infection. Even with those as obvious examples that can be pointed to, there are people that will still say, I don't need the vaccine. So that might be a hindrance to driving uptake or demand, even if the vaccine is available.
Right.
I know there's a question or two nestled in there somewhere. Thank you.
David. Yeah, and it's about people's experiences of, if they don't experience it as serious, do they feel the drive for the vaccine?
Until people lose a parent, do they want it? Until people see friends.
Right. So Amson, you've got a lot of interest in this. Veronica, I jumped in because I wanted to give David an opportunity to ask his question. We're running up against time, but I want to
just a minute. Yeah,
sure, Veronica, thanks.
Okay, when Barack Obama went to Ghana during his administration, of course, one of the things he mentioned was that the African governments, it's about time that they handle their own problems. So with that, of course, many African governments began to reduce their dependency on Western governments and Western nations, for example. And of course, the COVID case is something that the last presenter should also look into, what African governments have actually done in terms of being independent, not relying on foreign governments, particularly the United States and other Western nations. One of the African governments, for example, took a preventive measure rather than curative. So they have taken, they took preventive measures in their fight against COVID. So with that, of course, Nigeria and some other nations, they were able to combat COVID-19 pandemic. They were able to handle it and reduce the spread of that of the pandemic. So I think that is one crucial area that he should also look into, what African governments have done. Apart from that, also, the African governments also formed the African Task Force, which of course coordinates a quick response to to the pandemic. So therefore, preventing the transmission and mitigating community spread has been a policy that has been adopted by many African governments. So my suggestion is that many African governments, of course, are not relying totally on Western nations to give them handouts like COVID-19 vaccines. Of course, they are not expecting that as much. They do expect some from the World Health Organization. So I think that is an area that it should look at. Again, like Beth also said, we also have the play of Russia, particularly China in Africa. They're playing.
Do we just lose Veronica? Wait, let's see what happened.
I don't think she's here anymore.
Okay. She'll probably join us again. We are running up against time. Amson, I'm going to propose a few things. One is I'm going to propose that people we take the 5-minute break before Yulia's talk. And I also want to, oh, there you are, Veronica. What I was just saying was we're running out of time. I'm sorry that we lost you. I don't know what happened. You're muted.
What happened was that I think I was using my laptop and they ran out of charge.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, what I was going to say a few things. One is take it in, Amson. It's also recorded. And Amson is also, you're on a panel tomorrow talking about some similar issues. So it's clear that this is something that's generating a lot of interest and people have a lot of investment in this. And there will be another opportunity to engage with you on these questions tomorrow, right? Thank you everyone for your comments and feedback. This was really generative. Let's take a 5-minute break. Let's come back at 4. I also want to say one more shopkeeping thing. I said I was going to be ruthless and clearly I'm not, because we're going to go 15 minutes over. Chris Day and Eula, are you able to go until 4:45? Okay. I'm hoping everyone else can do that too. Let's just take a break, come back. We're going to start immediately at 4 o'clock with Eula Sagunas's paper. I'll see you shortly. I'm having a hard time with my web browser. Okay, welcome back. It's 4:02, sorry. I'm now going to turn things over to Eula Sagunas and Christopher Day. Eula Sagunas is a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology at UNC Chapel Hill. And she is, we are workshopping a paper that she's written that's tied to her dissertation research entitled NGO Dreaming in Urban Uganda. Christopher Day of the College of Charleston will be the faculty discussant. So Eula, I'm going to turn things over to you so you can situate the paper for us.
Great, thank you, Emily. And thank you for everyone for sticking around till the end. So my work is at the intersection of science and technology studies and medical anthropology. The general idea behind my work is that I'm studying how people who have undergone amputation use medical technology in order to reconstruct their identities and their social relationships. More specifically, in the past 10 years, there's been this big push on the part of medical device companies and professional schools in the United States, Canada, Western Europe, to design and manufacture medical devices, specifically prosthetic devices, for people living in low resource countries. And Uganda is considered one of those low resource countries. So I've been following how these devices have been designed with this disabled imaginary, if you will, in the US and in Canada. And I've been following them as they've been transmitted to my interlocutors, to their intended recipients in Uganda. And along the way, I've been thinking about the ideas that can get transmitted along with these products. And as far as the Ugandan aspect of my research, I'm working a lot with people who have undergone amputation, people who have suffered from limb loss for a multitude of reasons, ranging from people who have lost limbs in boda accidents, people who've stepped on landmines, people who lost limbs because of childhood malignancies. And I'm also talking with people who make these devices in Uganda. So these would be orthopedic surgeons, prosthetic device makers, people who see a lot of these patients and who also design devices knowing who their end users are. So that's a very different perspective than engineers and medical device companies that are creating these devices for imaginary end users. So this research started in 2016, which was a very different time and place. At least that's how it felt as far as doing research in Uganda. And at the time, a lot of the people that I spoke with were people who were in some way involved with an NGO. A lot of my interlocutors were people who worked with what could be termed as grassroots or local NGOs. And over the last 5 years or so, I've kept in touch with them. My research is ongoing right now in this weird, COVID-induced hybrid model where my research assistants are still in Uganda, still trying to do our interviews in the middle of elections, in the middle of national shutdowns. And so over the last 5 years, as I've been talking with my interlocutors, a lot of whom have continued to work in NGOs and who are still thinking about starting their own NGOs, I got very interested in this question of, well, why? What made this idea so compelling? And almost as like a little sideline in my dissertation research, I was like, you know what? I'm spending all this time thinking about COVID and what is going on with COVID in Uganda, and thinking about what is happening with my interlocutors who are often in very high risk groups. And what might be nice is to take a step back and do something that in some ways is a bit of a, okay, so let's think about dreams. Let's think about something that is less fraught right now. But then the more I started writing about it, the more I was like, okay, this is fraught in a different way. And someone whose writing I found very compelling was Lawrence Ralph's writing on this idea of renegade dreams. And so I thought about how trauma is the necessary negative space of dreams. And that's where this paper comes from. It's this idea of you have these dreams that require trauma, that wouldn't exist without the trauma that is behind them. So I would love to hear your thoughts about this paper, and also for a lot of you who've had experience working and living in Uganda, I'd want to hear from you very, very much. Thanks.
Great, thank you. That was interesting for me to hear because I know a little bit about your dissertation. I was wondering what brought you to this point too. Chris Day, political scientist, but former Médecins Sans Frontières aid worker. Maybe you have something to say about this paper.
I do. So thank you very much. And hi, Eula. How's it going?
Going.
All right, so NGO dreaming. All right, so this is a little bit outside my wheelhouse from a disciplinary point of view, but I have spent some time in Uganda, and I've also spent quite a bit of time around local grassroots Ugandan NGOs. So a lot of your descriptions of them are good and make a lot of sense. So just to summarize your argument a little bit here is that basically there's a big question here. Why would somebody want an NGO job in Uganda, especially now when like you describe in the paper, like back in the late 90s up until around 2008 when the war was ending in northern Uganda. Uganda was the site of a large number of international NGOs. I was there with MSF in 2004. And since then, they've all left, but in their place, there's all these grassroots organizations that are staffed by former national staff of international NGOs. And they've sort of taken the template of the management principles of international NGOs, and they've set them up all over the country, particularly in northern Uganda, to deal with issues of post-conflict reconstruction, dealing with ex-combatants, dealing with psychosocial issues, all sorts of almost everything you can think of. And what you point out is quite correct. I mean, for a lot of these young people, most of them are young, and they have some level of education, that getting an NGO job, even a local NGO job, first of all, it's a good job. You can support yourself, probably pay your school fees for your kids, and it also has some kind of status in the community, which is desirable. You know, those of us that are in academia, we would know nothing about that. So that matters, and maybe, just maybe, if you're lucky, you're actually doing something useful and worthwhile for a community, which matters as well. And so this is all really good stuff. And so I think, you know, let me just begin by pointing out what I think is compelling about the paper, and then talk a few things that you can address. Okay, so the first thing is that this idea of dreams, or ambitions, aspirations, this is a really interesting hook, and you know, we all have them, right? We all have dreams and aspirations and ambitions, but here this is a distinct story as trauma as the galvanizing force that really sort of cauterizes people's starting points, and then they eventually find these ways of learning how to become NGO people, right? And you sort of list all the things that they have to become in order to do this sort of personal experience. And it's a way to create meaning and have tangible impacts outside the dominant power arrangements of Ugandan politics and society. And this is really sort of the most important part of this. All right, and so I think there's a lot of really interesting raw material here in terms of your field work and the narratives that you're collecting from these individuals. And you also correctly identify sort of the NGOification of Uganda. You know, the way that you've mapped out how these NGOs work and how they look and how they feel is all quite correct. All right, but there's still a little bit that you have to do. There's some heavy lifting that you have to do to get this paper ready for prime time. And there's a couple of small things that would just make it better. And there's a number of bigger things. So let me go ahead and address the small things first. I would really tighten this argument, this link between trauma and action, and how sort of the dream matters. All right, so, and in order to do that, I think, you know, you sort of talk about the experience with like colonial oppression. I don't think that really helps your paper at all. I think you should focus on the trauma. You know, young people in Uganda, the average Ugandan is a 13-year-old girl, right? They don't even remember, they don't care about Museveni winning in 1986. They certainly don't think much about the colonial state. And even though it mattered, I think the thrust of your contribution here is really coming from this trauma, directly from conflict. And so talking about colonial oppression, I don't think that's necessary for you to make your point. I think it just sort of clutters things. And another small thing, when you're listing these, I think there's 3 things that you list that these actors need to do to become NGO people. And one of them is develop charisma. I'm not sure if this is very helpful either. And you talk about the Weberian definition of charisma. You know, my impression of charisma is like, it's either you have it or you don't. I'm not sure if it's something you can work on or acquire over time. I get what you're saying, but that's much more of a kind of an instrumental marketing of oneself, other than the sort of innate charisma story. All right, so those are a couple of things. Now there's a couple of other bigger things that I think you really need to address in order to really get this paper where it needs to be. You have enough raw material here and understanding of how NGOs work in Uganda. I think you need to provide a very, very concise like definition of the typical grassroots NGO in Uganda. What does it look like? What's an anatomy? What's its typical range of activities? And you know, there's a range, but I think it's good if you actually say, okay, this is how you know an NGO when you see it. All right, so that's one. The second thing is that I think it would really, really help if you got out of Kampala. NGOs, there's tons of NGOs in Kampala, but where they're really having a lot of impact in the places that matter for you are in places like Gulu and Pader and Kitgum. And these are the people that have been directly affected by the conflict in northern Uganda. When people go to Kampala, it's usually for different reasons, and it's a different type of sort of socioeconomic milieu than you'd expect to see elsewhere in the country. And there's NGOs everywhere. I mean, you could go to Fort Portal. Jinja is like NGO Central, and of course, I'm acutely aware that there's a lot of Mzungu academic tourists running around northern Uganda. I'm one of them, and so are my students. But these are where the really interesting NGOs are actually really doing interesting things. And these are the NGOs that you're describing, full of people that endured the conflict, that stuck around. They didn't flee to Kampala, they stayed in Gulu to help people directly affected by the conflict and all the post-conflict stuff. So there's GRG, Grassroots Reconciliation. That's an NGO that I know pretty well. They're now branching out and working in refugee camps, South Sudan refugee camps as well. So this is I would encourage you to get out of Kampala and see what's going on up country, because that will give you not only comparative leverage, but also address a rural urban dynamic that I think matters a lot to how these NGOs work and how trauma shapes the trajectory of individuals from being traumatized and entering into an NGO life. All right, so that's another thing. Okay, here's a really big thing that you talk about, and that this is really a huge potential contribution of your paper, okay, but it kind of fizzles out. And this is when you talk about how this provides avenues for people to build income and status and meaning outside prevailing power structures. What are you talking about? What's the power structure you're talking about? And this is something that's not really identified in your paper. I mean, I think I know what you're talking about, right? But you should put it front and center. And so this becomes a story about how NGOs in Uganda, grassroots NGOs, form whatever you can call it. I guess you can call it civil society in Uganda. And this requires you to engage in a whole literature on how these groups organize to form sort of countervailing pressures on the dominant hegemonic power structures. Or are you arguing that they're kind of fleet-footed groups that are kind of circumventing them and not really being noticed? I'm not really sure. I mean, you said yourself that, you know, there's a lot of regulation of NGOs. I mean, if only they could do that with missionary groups going to paint orphanages, that would be great. But they, you know, you get shut down if you don't register. I think that's pretty normal though. And, you know, my impression of NGOs, local NGOs, is that, like you say, they serve a governance function that the government might not be willing to provide, especially in places like northern Uganda. They might be more inclined to do it directly in places like Kampala, but they're probably more inclined to delegate to, oh, the NGOs will take care of that stuff in places where we don't care about. So, you know, this is really the thrust of the paper, right? You know, it's about how these people find meaning and create these webs of networks through the development of these basic civil society things outside the power structures. What's the power structure? Well, it's the Museveni regime. You know, you know, my good friend and colleague here, Moses Kisa, can probably talk a lot about that. You know, how they dominate civil society, how they just a month ago shot 54 protesters, supporters of Bobi Wine. This is something that you need to address in the paper. You know, they're regulated, but they're not demobilized. These NGOs, they're allowed to exist within certain thresholds. Okay, so that's another thing. Another thing I was thinking about, so dreams and trauma. You know, I was thinking about what's the relationship between trauma, dreams, and people's time horizons, right? So we all think, you know, about our aspirations and our dreams, about what we want to do with our lives, but I wonder what effects trauma has on how far in the future you can see, right? My impression is that it kind of limits how far in the future you can see. If you're living in an uncertain environment where your financial security is precarious and maybe your human security is precarious, it's hard to see too far into the future. Me personally, I can see till 4:30 today, or maybe 4:45 now that Emily's extended it. But you know, our time horizons are shaped by certain things, and you know, those of us in this room don't have the the constraints of having experienced this type of Civil War trauma that a lot of your research subjects have. So I would give that a little bit of a think, right? I mean, dreams are a really interesting theoretical hook here, but how far into the future can they really see if they've experienced this? And this is kind of more of a, maybe maybe you have to engage a little bit in psychology literature, I'm not sure. All right, so there's that. And you know, the other thing, so for the NGO side of this, there is actually a pretty significant literature out there on local NGOs. I can't remember the name of the book right now. I'm going to look it up for you, but somebody wrote a book on the creation of local NGOs in Africa as international NGOs leave. And sort of there's this endowment of people that have gained experience with international NGOs. They take this organizational endowment and skill set and bring them directly into the creation of local NGOs as kind of a logical, rational next step. Your contribution to this story is this other thing where people get traumatized and want to fulfill their dreams of doing this kind of thing. But you know, I think it's important to interrogate the literature on how local NGOs become kind of a way of just shifting responsibility from international NGOs to local NGOs, and it allows the ongoing retreat of responsibility of the state to providing basic social welfare functions for its citizens. So I think that's kind of an important piece of it as well. So that's what I have to say about it. I'm happy to keep talking about it as much as you want. And I'm happy to put you in touch with some of the folks on the ground that I managed to meet in Gulu if you need some research contacts there, if COVID lets you go back there anytime soon.
All right, thanks. That's a lot to work through and talk about. I'm going to fight you on the charisma thing, but not on
okay.
But not right now, because I was thinking about that. I don't know. Eula, how do you digest this?
Yeah, thank you. That was very helpful. It was very helpful in terms of I had these, these sort of ideas that I wasn't sure which ones were worth pursuing. And I appreciate that you articulated several of these ideas that I think were more compelling and probably also have some literature behind them that both the NGO literature and also some of the psych-anthro literature.
Yeah.
So that was very helpful. I think one of the unexpected findings that I had was how many of these NGOs that were Kampala-based were actually located in Gulu and located in Lira and in some of the areas in northern Uganda. And they had an office with somebody that sometimes staffed it in Kampala because this suggested that they had made the big time, right? This was a way to continue fostering their relationships with other NGOs and also with transnational NGOs. So they would do most of their work in northern Uganda, and their office, they would have like a satellite office, a room that they would have. So I think I do need to make that clearer, that the work that they were doing was not really in Kampala. Because again, a lot of my interlocutors had limb loss because of landmine accidents, and you don't have landmines in Kampala. So I think, making that clearer, and also distinguishing between the rural and the urban aspect of what NGOs are doing in Uganda, I think is very, I think that's very helpful. I think the idea of the time horizon is something I hadn't thought about at all. And that is also a really interesting rabbit hole that I want to go into and think about more at length, because it's not something I've thought of before. But yeah, I mean, you're totally right. It's what kind of futures are these people envisioning? What kind of futures are they planning for? And what kind of futures are they trying to avoid? So yeah, I think that is something that I want to look back through my notes and see if anybody has talked about that or really thought about it.
Well, let me just come in real quick. They haven't. This is something that I was working on another project, and so this is why it stood out to me. And I don't know if it's something that you have to theorize, you know, because who knows how this works, right? It probably varies from individual to individual, but you can kind of say, okay, this is sort of make it sort of an exogenous thing that says, okay, well, we don't really know what causes variations in time horizons. It could be genetics, for God's sakes, you know, who knows? But it's just something to think about and to address.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I just sent a link to the book that I was thinking about.
Yeah, I looked at that. That was helpful too for me because this is so outside of my wheelhouse.
Oh, great. Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions or comments? Hila, did I cut you off?
Nope.
I'm going to open the floor now to more open discussion about the paper.
I'll just make a suggestion in terms of, I mean, on this issue, I think Chris is right about there being this, political science-based literature, I guess, where there's a lot of interesting work on civil society and on NGOs. I mean, the trauma part is interesting. I mean, I found in Western Tanzania that, I've often said, like, people don't want to grow up and start a business. They want to grow up and start an NGO. I mean, that's like that's sort of the thing that people do. And there's lots of reasons for it. There's resources available. But I would suggest looking at the work of Eileen Tripp. Eileen Marie Tripp is a political scientist at Wisconsin. She's a past president of the African Studies Association, but she's done a ton of work in Uganda and Tanzania. She has a great article from the mid-90s in the African Studies Review, if I'm not mistaken, talking about associational life in Uganda and Tanzania, looking especially at women's associations. And she sort of makes a case there that, like, NGOs and these associations, very grassroots associations, are sort of training grounds for democracy, which I think is an interesting argument. I often, when I've used that in my teaching, I've often set it up with a piece by John Makumbe, I think in International Affairs around the same time, where the title of the article is something like, "Is there a civil society in Africa?" And he actually challenges that, and sort of it challenges the assumption that it builds democracy, because he says that many of these NGOs are actually sort of little dictatorial fiefdoms with no internal democracy, and or they're like a man and a dog, which is they're a man in a briefcase who happens to be able to write proposals in English. Anyway, so those are two articles that I've found useful on this. Obviously, they're more dated, but there is I think the 90s was this time of this explosion of NGOs in so many. I know in Tanzania it went to from something like 300 registered NGOs to, by the end of the 90s, it was like 4,000 or something like that. So I would look at those things.
Yeah, what did you say? You mentioned in your article or your paper that you have those numbers about how many bloody NGOs there are now in as many years in Uganda.
Did you call them bloody NGOs?
Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah, no, I'm trying to find that they started from 3,508 organizations in 1999 to 14,000 in 2018. And then they only dropped down to 2,000 because the government was like, no more of this. And we want everything that you guys have brought in terms of money and resources. We'll take all of it. So it was a huge jump. And, even though the government did crack down on them, a lot of those 14,000 are still standing. They're just not registered anymore.
Right. I mean, coming off of that and just circling back to that point, I mean, I think what we think we know about how Ugandan politics works is that, it's lazy up to a point, right? There's a lot of things that flourish like NGOs up to the point where the government sees it as something that it can appropriate or something that it has to regulate because it has some sort of threat to it. And those are the NGOs that you're most likely to see in politically problematic places like northern Uganda, or maybe even in the capital city. Like for just because by way of an example, a few years ago, when microfinance was the big fashionable thing in Africa more generally, I think it's something else now, but the brother of the president, Salim Saleh, became the minister of microfinance.
Mhm.
So that's how they do.
I was just thinking, Beth, when you were, I jumped up to pull this, I'll put it in the chat rather than doing this, but Eiley Tripp, I don't know if you use Tripp's work, Eula. Okay, so I'll share this citation too. Her book on women in power in post-conflict Africa, I found as a historian who dabbles in an interdisciplinary world, I find her discussion about the post-conflict and gender formation really useful too. But another good citation. Moses, I was wondering.
All right. Hi. So yeah, this is interesting. I enjoyed reading the paper. So I wanted to raise a couple of kind of counterfactual questions that you can think about. So the hook, as Chris was saying, is trauma, post-conflict experiences that people have. Would you say that in the absence of trauma, the NGO economy in Uganda would not be what it is? Which, sort of points you in the direction of what's the larger context, not just actually Uganda, but broader socioeconomic context in which this, dreaming about NGOs actually flourishes. If you look at the huge literature on the political economy of NGOs, the key issue is that NGOs tend to be a feature of poor countries. And so whether there is conflict or no conflict, whether there is trauma or no trauma, there's certain broader drivers of the NGO phenomenon. Now, I understand you're coming at this from the point of view of an anthropologist, and that's perfectly understandable. But I think it's important to think about the way you steward this focus on trauma. It has to be located in a bigger conceptual and theoretical purview around the political economy of NGOs, not just in a country like Uganda, but sort of perhaps in the global south, more generally conceived. Which is, of course, is connected to another second counterfactual question, which is, is this unique to Uganda? If you went to Malawi, which is a country that has never experienced a civil war, as far as I can recall, perhaps you'll find as many NGOs as you might find in Uganda, maybe fewer. But there's also the aspect of, I have been a big critic of NGOs generally in Uganda, and I've written about that in newspaper op-eds, and the NGO entrepreneurs in Uganda don't like me for that. But I look at NGOs as individual entrepreneurial endeavors that are born of the problems of a limited economy of, Uganda, a very small economy, and $30 billion GDP. It's a country where many people who have a little bit of education are not going to find opportunities to pursue. And so, innovating through NGO-izing life is, one way of trying to look for opportunities that otherwise are unavailable from, mainstream economy. So, and so I in many ways, the whole NGO phenomenon is as much about responding to social problems that they purport to solve as about individuals engaging in their own entrepreneurship for their own very specific and personal interests. Interests that oftentimes are couched in terms of serving the community and serving social needs, when really it's Chris Day wanting to have a job and get his own dream, okay, by owning an NGO, and that has very little to do with whether Chris serves a certain disadvantaged, marginalized community in northern Uganda or not. And so you end up with all these briefcase NGOs that are really personal possessions and that are controlled by the individuals who found them. So I mean, in some ways, reading this paper takes one to rethinking the earlier debates about NGOs, which sort of, I mean, this debate has gone away somewhat. And in the case of Uganda, the Ugandan civil society is really an NGO civil society, which is sort of another issue about understanding the broader political economy of NGOs. And there is a recent book on Uganda, the Dynamics of Neoliberal Transformation, which I think might be useful for you, because in that book, there are chapters about how neoliberalism enables the thriving of the NGO economy in Uganda, because with the neoliberal economy, you have the state rollback and sort of outsourcing the state to the NGO sector, which NGO sector is bankrolled by international actors, by international donors, and so on and so forth. And then the civil society that you have is really not civil society. It's humanitarianism, and associational life has completely been wiped away. Unionization has pretty much been killed, and all those have been at the behest of the neoliberal political economy in Uganda. So I think I think the paper is worth pursuing as far as I can see. It has very interesting contributions to make, but it would be helpful if you try and back up a little bit and look at these broader issues and how you can situate the paper in them.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I think so when I was trying to think through these issues, a lot of the literature that I did find was political science literature, which there is some tension with the anthropology for that. I think in terms of both how our discipline really focuses on the minute. So I think for anthropologists, a lot of the data that I have is ethnographic. I am limited in some ways by the conversations that I have with people and by their perspectives as well. So it is good to hear, okay, take a big step back and think about not just where do these people fit within Uganda, but also where do they fit within the larger NGO system. So thank you for that.
Great. This is a great interdisciplinary, maybe we should always do this, have one, always have like one presenter from one discipline and then just have a disciplinary perspective. It brings the area studies element out in great ways. Mm-hmm. So as a historian, I feel like Switzerland right now.
I would say too, I would just add, I'm going back to like Eiley Tripp and stuff. So, I mean, I think, a lot of these people who've done work in this area are, would consider themselves more sort of political anthropologists. I mean, they bridge these. And so Eiley Tripp actually grew up, her mother was an anthropologist, I believe, in Tanzania, all her Lisa Swants. So there's a long, deep history in her family of East Africa connection and stuff. So a very interdisciplinary one anyway.
And no one's expecting like a regression model from this paper or anything like that.
I'm making the mistake of doing that tomorrow, Chris.
Oh boy, okay. Can't wait.
One thing I was thinking of too, Eula, is Greg Mann's work on non-governmentality. I mean, I know that this isn't your bigger, I know that this is not the heart of your dissertation project necessarily. So I know that you're writing about this in different ways, but I wonder if the way that he conceptualizes the move to a non-governmentality model, he's writing about the Sahel, but he is, and Amson's familiar with this. He's framing a particular moment after starting in the 1970s in certain parts of Africa as being really driven by non-governmentality. And I just wonder if that could be useful to think about. Any other comments or feedback? Yeah, Amson.
The stuff, the writing on trauma is really interesting, and in terms of NGOs and the and maybe a more sort of low-lying level of scale, sort of dropping down from the sort of larger idea of NGOization, I guess, throughout the continent. The performance and enactment of trauma, whether that's like directly tied to particular benefits and activities, or a sort of a passive enactment of trauma, and how that in and of itself is a fairly sometimes explicit, but a fairly widely known sort of requirement for not just NGOs themselves, right? It's sort of, there's the idea that they're acting on a particular trauma, whether that trauma is discursively or evenly distributed throughout the nation is another thing. But for example, folks who want to solicit help from NGOs, they have to produce a certain level of trauma or like affect in order for them to be believed. And Miriam Tickton and others have written about how they're not talking about NGOs specifically, but in terms of like humanitarian care, folks their trauma has to be worn on their bodies in a particular way that makes them legible to not just the state, but to these sorts of non-state actors. So trauma is a very productive force, I think is what I'm trying to say in a long way. So if you thought about that, then you can ignore my comment, but that's all.
I agree that trauma, there's a lot of interesting potential for you here, Eula, with the trauma, unpacking the role that trauma plays. I found that to be one of the provocative parts of what you're writing. And it made me think too about what Amson was just describing, the requirement of a trauma story. Same thing with asylum cases. Like, you have to produce a narrative of trauma that makes you legible in a certain way. It's there's such a market for trauma stories. I think that's something that it speaks to a lot of different dynamics that a lot of us are grappling with in different avenues.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask Amson, did you talk to Peter like last week? Amson and I have the same advisor, Peter Redfield. So the question of trauma and what does it mean in the enactment of trauma? Yeah, that's like a weekly conversation, I think. And what it means and how do you pull those threads? And what does it mean where, my interlocutors aren't refugees generally. I think maybe one of them spent time in a refugee camp. But yeah, I think trying to determine how is this different than these trauma stories that, enable people to enter new countries or benefit in some material, financial way from their stories. It's hard to tease out. And it's a really important, I think, critique anytime, you're trying to think about trauma and even using the word trauma, because I think it's just gotten really loaded. And I think it's gotten defined in a certain direction by anthropologists. And so anytime you use it, there's always the risk of bringing all of that, all that baggage with it. But yeah, which doesn't mean that it's unnecessary to use or that you can't use it. But it does mean that I think a lot about how is it used, who's, how valuable is it, what does it mean to different people, and how do their stories change as well. So yeah, so thanks for bringing it up, Emerson.
One other thing, Iowa Ong also writes about, she does not explicitly write about trauma, so that's a word that you probably won't see, so that's evades that sort of issue. But she writes extensively about NGOs, so she's focusing on East and specifically Southeast Asia, so it's a whole different geopolitical context. For example, writing about the sort of, for women migrant workers, NGOs have this sort of ability to protect and also reproduce some of the harms that they actually face. So I'll find the paper for you, and she's written a few things about NGOs and the power of NGOs in terms of like limiting, but also trying to expand the rights that women migrants face throughout Southeast Asia. And so if I find that, I'll make sure to send you the citation for that.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
All right, folks, I'm going to cut us off. Eula, thank you so much for your paper, and Chris for your comments.
You're welcome.
And everybody for your comments, Moses and Beth and Amson. So this concludes the second annual Emerging Scholar Workshop. And just because you've done one, as Holly can attest to, doesn't mean you can't do another one. So Eula and Amson, if you wanna come back, we'd love to see you. Stacy's back, and anyone else. So please share this with colleagues and graduate students. Hopefully we'll all be together in person in Florida next year, and maybe even in Charleston in the fall.
Or are you nominating Charleston for the fall
I don't know.
conference?
Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Tune in to the this meeting.
Nobody likes to come here.
All right, everyone. So I want to remind everyone that Omar Ali will be speaking at 5 p.m. And it'll be a webinar format, I believe. Is that right, Stacy? It'll be a webinar, so you won't be able to see everyone, but I hope that's the timer. I hope you're able to log on, and otherwise we'll see you tomorrow.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.